I recall a young man I spoke to who was working on prison visits in one of the prisons in which I was doing this research. And he was a great big guy, and he'd served in the armed forces and so on. And he said when he joined the prison service, he said, the governor took one look at me and said, "Oh, you're a big lad. You'll be good for doing control and restraint, cell searches, security. That's you." And he said, "Okay." So off he went and did that for some time. But he was really, really keen to work with families and sort of supporting family contact in visits, which is what he was doing when I was speaking to him. But he said it took him years to persuade the powers that be where he was, that even though he looked like this and he had this background, that he could do this work well. And once he was given the chance, he demonstrated that he had all the skills that were needed there.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. We're here today to talk about prisons and the military and the crossover between the two, which is a fascinating subject. Dominique and Jennifer, would you like to say just a few words to introduce yourselves?
Absolutely, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. I'm Dominique. I'm Professor of Carceral Geography at the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And I've been doing prisons research, I guess, for the last 15 or so years. It seems like a really long time. And this particular topic of interest, I suppose, is something that I've come to over the last 3 or 4 years in collaboration with Jen.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Turner, and I am the leader of the Crime and Carcerality Research Group at the University of Oldenburg. I am interested primarily in the connections between prison and wider society, and that's included a wide variety of different things, including prison architecture and the kind of cultural manifestations of the inside and outside of prison. But most recently, the prison military complex, which is what has taken me into my most recent collaborations with Dominique.
Hi, really glad to see you both today. Dominique, we really enjoyed the conversation with you last year, which is why we're really glad to get you on again to have another conversation with you, and also with Jen this time to discuss the military. But we wondered if you could tell us a bit about how you came to be studying the significance of the military for the prisons.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. So I suppose this was not a topic certainly not a topic that I'd planned to do research in. I'm not sure if Jen has a different sort of backstory to it, but really it came about for myself through doing other prison research. So specifically I was doing a project on prison visitation and the impact of that on prisoners' well-being and connection to family and so on. And that obviously involved interviewing prisoners, family members and staff who are involved in the visitation process. And then in other projects after that, I've also been speaking to prison staff about the design of prisons and the spaces that they work in and so on, I guess related to the topic I was speaking about last year. And in all of those conversations with staff across those different pieces of research, the initial sort of questions would always be, how long have you been doing this job and how do you come to be doing this job? The kind of puts somebody at ease questions, I suppose. And I was struck by how often people would say, "Oh, well, I was in the army and then," or "I was in the RAF and and then I joined the prison service." And it was never something that I could pursue in those conversations. I guess initially I didn't think it was something particularly of interest, but I heard it so often and could never, because my research project wasn't about that backstory, I could never kind of probe that background and that experience. But again, I heard it so often that I thought, this is a thing, why don't I know already about the importance of military experience for prison staff? So I suppose that's how I came to the topic. I mean, some of that research I was doing with Jennifer, And I'm sure that she probably had some similar conversations, and I guess we kind of both came to a realization that this was perhaps something that merited further investigation. I suppose some of those conversations that I'm sure we'll come on to afterwards gave me at least an indication that this experience might be significant, and that there was something more to learn here.
Yeah, it's certainly a very familiar story for those of us who work in prisons, the number of staff that you encounter with that kind of history. I also wondered whether either of you had connections to the military. Jen, you're based in Germany, I believe, and having lived there in my teenage years because my dad's ex-military, I did wonder if that was how you'd come to be there.
Sadly, nothing quite as interesting as that in terms of my personal history. I joined the University of Oldenburg a couple of years ago for kind of personal and career progression. But strangely enough, now I reflect on this as part of this project. I during my university years as an undergraduate, I was in the officer training corps, so I did have some if you can call that military experience, although I suspect it was slightly more student orientated, so it did have some other connotations to it at the time. But then I retired from that for health reasons and actually applied to be a prison officer, and had been entered into the fast track to governor program that was at that time. And so now I sometimes reflect a little bit on what parts of my personal and sort of transferable skills set was intertwined with some of the things that we'll be talking about today, but ultimately ended up in academia researching prisons rather than in the army or as a prison staff member.
That's a really interesting connection, though. Can you define what you mean by military? Is that does come with certain assumptions and stereotypes when it's applied to justice, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, absolutely. I mean, shall I begin, Jen? Or yeah, I think it's a really difficult term to define. I mean, I think we're clear about what the military is when we're talking about, you know, the armed forces of a state, the army, the RAF, and so on. There are also obviously other kinds of military organisations which are not kind of state-sponsored, paramilitary. There's all sorts of conflict which involves armed forces of different kinds. And then there's, I suppose, the notion of what this term means when we apply it to other things. So when we use military as an adjective rather than a noun, so what connotations it has, particularly when we apply it to the prison service. And I think one of the things that Jen and I came across quite early on when we started to think about doing some research into this topic was when we were reading criminological research, trying to find out what people knew already about particularly the experience of former military personnel in the prison service as staff, so importantly distinct from veterans in custody. So prison staff who had this experience. I think we came across quite a lot of stereotyping of what the military might mean and what connotations military experience might have for prison staff. Not, it seemed, based on an awful lot of in-depth empirical research. And I mean, we were, I suppose, quite surprised by how little research appeared to have been done directly on that topic, really exploring it in depth. But there definitely seemed to be a sense in which criminologists writing about the prison service and studying prison staff were quite, well, let's just say they weren't entirely enthusiastic about the potential benefits of military experience. And there seemed to be a sense in which when a prison was described as militaristic, that was a bad thing. That was a sort of shorthand for this prison is run on too harsh lines, it's too strict, it's not empathetic, and a sense in which there might also be things going on inside that prison that we might not want to see. So this, I suppose, one of the things that we became quite interested in, quite apart from the experience of staff and what influence this might have on the way that they do the job, why is it that people who've been writing about the prison service have seemed to have this notion that by describing it as military or identifying military tendencies or sort of characteristics, why are they seeing that as kind of implicitly a negative?
Did you have a sense of what impact that had on ex-military staff, that those kind of stereotypes were bandied around the justice system?
I think it's really hard to say. I mean, I think we see a difference between the way in which academic researchers have written about this topic and maybe the way in which the prison service itself sees it. So I think one of the things that we also did was sort of look into, as far as we could do this, the influence that military personnel or former armed forces staff had on the running of the prison service over quite a long time. And you see some really, really prominent names going back, quite far, who had experience in the armed forces. We are obviously looking at the times when they were prominent. Everybody had served in the armed forces, or most young men had, so it's kind of expected that they would have this experience, but they seemed to talk quite a lot about kind of the importance of that experience or what they were bringing to the prison service. So I suppose looking at more contemporary policy discourse, and certainly the ways in which recruitment drives, of which there have been a few over the last few years, directly trying to recruit armed forces leavers into the prison service. There's quite a lot of sort of talk about the benefits of the discipline that they'll bring, the strength that they'll bring, the ways in which they will support prison staff in trying to do their job well. So I think there's perhaps a distinction here between the way in which the prison service and ex-military personnel within it as staff are talked about by the prison service itself and inside of the ministry, compared to the way in which academic researchers might have been thinking about it on the outside.
Thank you. And Jen, can you outline for us some of the ways that the military is intertwined with incarceration within the UK? Is this a pattern that's distinct for the UK, or is it relevant to prisons in other countries as well?
Thanks for that question, Naomi. I think that's a really big question to answer, and it might be one that maybe we need to come back to after we've talked a little bit about some of the things we've been looking at in detail, because I think that in the course of the last year or two of the work, and particularly the writing that Dom and I have been doing, is to think through different associations with military more broadly. So, of course, the most primary way we've been discussing is thinking about how prison staff might have military backgrounds, and that's really where we started this project. And as Dom explained earlier on, thinking through these connections of employment, where we'd heard in interviews on other projects that staff had themselves prior career experiences of the military. But we also see wider connections between not just staff, but also, perhaps we'll talk a little bit more about this, the use of former military or militarily associated buildings that become part of the prison landscape, and then perhaps later are transformed into something else and might come back into the prison and or military realm, so to speak. So we see a lot of prisons being built on former military bases, and also still some accommodation blocks today being used for various purposes within the prison landscape. And then we also have these connections more broadly that recently Dominique and I have been thinking about in terms of the relationship between prison and war, and how the prison landscape is connected to various wider activities of conflict that go on in society. So I think that's quite a broad question to begin with, and maybe we can come back to some of those interesting interconnections as we go through the rest of our conversation.
Thank you. Do other countries have such a big military contingent amongst their their staff?
Go on, Jen.
I was just going to say, I apologise, I hadn't covered that angle. I think that's hard to tell. We haven't explored other countries' connections, for example, with prison staff yet, but it's something that is ongoing with some of our colleagues, Rose Ricciardelli and Anna Eriksson, and a wider team of other scholars who are interested in prison staff experiences. So at least in that relationship, in terms of prison staff involvement in the prison service, we're still not quite sure yet, but we're working towards that. But I'll pass across to Dom, because Dom's most familiar with some of these wider ideas about war and conflict and so on.
Thanks, Jen. I suspect that it's really common. So I suspect that across I suppose, what we would call prisons in the Western world, that the recruitment of prison staff, of prison staff who have military experience is widespread. Certainly, a very, very quick Google will find you lots of images of American prison staff talking in very glowing terms about their experience in the military and what it brings to their prison work. We suspect it's the case in Canada as well, which is partly where we're doing some further research with those colleagues that Jen was talking about. And in other contexts, I think we also see connections between the prison and the military through staffing, which sort of hark back to the uniformed, sort of male-dominated, rank-oriented nature in many, but not all places, obviously, of the military and prison staffing. So some research that I did in the Russian Federation quite a long time ago now, I was really struck there by the linkages between the military, or at least military uniform, military address and ranking and so on, and the ways in which people talked about their prison staffing service as being sort of a national service itself. So a sense in which being part of the prison service was only kind of one step away from serving in the armed forces in terms of its patriotic duty, if you like. And I mean, there's sort of long-standing connections there in the UK as well. So as I understand it, there are pension benefits if you move from the armed forces into the prison service, in terms of sort of being able to retain a sense of Crown service. I don't know quite how that works, but that's certainly something that we've been told by ex-forces staff, that there was some sort of benefit in staying there, and some sense in which this enabled prison staff to kind of stay to an extent within a familiar institution, a familiar sort of environment, obviously with other ex-forces staff as well around them. And I think that begins to speak, I suppose, to some of the questions about sort of why do military leavers see the prison service as an attractive workplace, or why have they seen it as such over quite a long period of time, when we know that leaving the military can be quite a challenging experience itself. There's lots of research that talks about what's called the military to civilian transition, and how difficult that can be for people losing the sort of daily structure of the armed forces, being sort of having their daily life, you know, not controlled, but kind of steered to an extent by the institution they are part of, and a sense of sort of losing focus, losing direction, struggling to kind of cope with everyday life in some cases. Obviously not for all, of course, but certainly that's a sort of pathway that's talked about really often in relation to veterans in custody, that they haven't coped well with that transition. So I suppose we were partly interested in thinking through, what does joining the prison service mean for people entering that military civilian transition, and what role can it play? So is it a sort of a bit of, you know, familiarity in various ways, and is it a way of maintaining that sense of camaraderie, which seems to be really important within the armed forces? Can prison sort of rekindle or renew some of that sense of teamwork and connection?
I've certainly heard prison officers talk about them as a service being like the fourth armed force, if you like, and the fact that non-prison service employees are referred to as civilians, I think also kind of like speaks to that kind of approach. But I think it's quite astounding that there hasn't been lots of research onto the influence of the military and armed forces, ex-armed forces personnel within the prison service, really. I'm wondering how much of that has to do with the perhaps more liberal lefty attitude and philosophy of many academics, and whether there's been a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater rather than really digging into something.
I wish I knew. So we were just really struck by how little there is. I mean, there's some fantastic research that has been done by colleagues of ours, and elsewhere, looking at it in a great deal of depth into prison staff culture, prison staff identity, the ways in which prison staff culture is sort of generated within the workplace, all sorts of things, really, really detailed and great work. And in most of that, military service is mentioned, so it's not overlooked completely, but it's that's never the focus of the research which has been done. And I wish that I knew why, because it seems to us that it's a really important thing. And I suppose the more that we looked into it, and particularly a paper that Jen was leading on recently, we looked in a kind of parallel way at research which had been done into the way that military leavers work in other professions when they go into them. So we know, for example, that they go into the police quite a lot, they go into teaching, they go into business, so all sorts of different areas. And research has been done in those other fields, looking at military leavers and how they do those jobs, and it finds that military experience is predictive of certain patterns of work. So, for example, being more likely to stick at the teaching profession than somebody who perhaps is conventionally trained, being more conservative in business. So working in certain ways, which researchers who've looked at these ex-forces staff, find that they are doing. So it seemed to us that military service is predictive of the ways in which people do their subsequent job. So I suppose we were a little bit puzzled as to why, given that this is the case, why I suppose research into prison staff tends to start with them in the prison, and it doesn't really think about what led them to that point, apart from, for example, to think perhaps about the age at which they are when they join, and sort of think about to what extent does joining the prison service at a very young age, which we of course can do here, how does that affect how prison staff can do their job? And that's a different but related question, I suppose, because if someone has done military service first, by definition they're older than they might have been had they gone straight into prison at the youngest age that they could. But as to why this has been not researched in depth up to now, I don't know, because in that research which we looked at, the very brief mentions tended to say things which sort of smacked of the military sort of stereotypes, that ex-military personnel really aren't suited for this work. They're not flexible enough, they're not able to show compassion, they're obsessed with control and discipline, they're great at locking up, counting heads and pushing people behind their doors, but they're not good at the sort of softer, rehabilitative, interpersonal skills, which we thought, well, that's quite a generalisation, really. And I suppose for me that didn't resonate particularly with the conversations that I'd had in those early pieces of research where I'd come across former military staff and had quite interesting conversations with them. So I recall a young man I spoke to who was working on prison visits in one of the prisons in which I was doing this research, and he was a great big guy, and he'd served in the armed forces and so on, and he said when he joined the prison service, he said, the governor took one look at me and said, "Oh, you're a big lad, you'll be good for doing control and restraint, cell searches, security, that's you. And he said, okay, so, off he went and did that for some time. But he was really, really keen to work with families and sort of supporting family contact in visits, which is what he was doing when I was speaking to him. But he said it took him years to persuade the powers that be where he was, that even though he looked like this and he had this background, that he could do this work well. And once he was given the chance, he demonstrated that he had all the skills that were needed there. So I suppose that kind of made me think maybe there's more to this. Perhaps this experience brings more than we would stereotypically think that it does. Perhaps there's more to former armed forces personnel than just being well disciplined and punctual.
I noticed.
Thank you.
I noticed in one of your papers you reference an old colleague of mine, Jane Coltman, who had also been in the army and worked with us at Grendon. And Jane is a very gentle, thoughtful character, slightly disorganised. So the opposite end of the stereotype, which I guess would be something like Mr. Mackay in the TV programme Porridge. In fact, Porridge contains those two kind of extremes there, doesn't it? So, I mean, I suppose they're all people, aren't they? I mean, I suppose the personal characteristics vary widely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the study that Jennifer and I did, we didn't have the opportunity to interview people through that because of the nature of it and the limits that we had on the funding and so on. But in the qualitative data that we have from that, one of the things that people stressed is how different people are, that just because you have military experience, it doesn't make you this type of person and not that type. And indeed, some of the things that people who weren't in the military, so we surveyed both people within the prison service who did have this experience and who didn't, and those who didn't pointed out quite often that people with a military background were able to show empathy and compassion, and sometimes better than those who hadn't got this experience. I remember particularly a quote from somebody saying, that maybe from the experience of having lost colleagues in theatres of war, military background staff understand really keenly how important it is for prisoners to be able to attend funerals, and perhaps did differently from those who don't have this experience, which would seem to me to be counter to the argument that they're not able to show empathy and so on.
Yeah, certainly that's borne out with experience, I think, in terms of some of the best officers that I've worked with have had lots of years of former military experience, but being very empathic, compassionate, creative and adaptive, and really being able to work in a very psychological way within a treatment service, which would buck against the idea that they're rigid and can only work with routine.
Yeah.
So, moving on, I was wondering about social class, and I haven't read all of your papers on this subject, but it seems to me that social class doesn't get a huge profile. There's a particular reference to rural, low-class people working in prisons, which seemed to, obviously it wasn't a quote from you, it was a quote from somebody else. But I was remembering how when I was doing my initial training as a social worker, I spent some time at Huntercombe Borstal. And one of the things that struck me was the difference between the governorial staff and the ordinary prison officer staff. And then later on, as I did more work with the prison service, I began to recognise that some of the most senior governors were quite kind of how to put it, gentrified people, really. And I think that's changed quite a lot. Anyway, that's not really a question, but I wonder what you could say about social class among this group.
Jen, you?
I'm thinking. So I suppose, we have seen a change in the way, I guess, prison officers, and then particularly, for want of a better phrase, higher ranking, or perhaps advanced roles are recruited in the prison service, and so maybe we do see a difference in the nature of managerial positions today in the prison service. In terms of this work and the work that we've been doing, it has been difficult to unpack social class in, using your phrase, in relation to prior military service. And one of the things that we did look to would be things like qualifications, educational qualifications, and whether that was an indicator of performance of job roles or achievements of certain particular promotional aspects in relation to prison service employment. And I think what we do see from this study is that we do see a tendency for those with military experience to have lower formal qualifications than non-military cohorts. And so maybe to that end, are we talking about a set of prison service staff who are entering the prison service with military backgrounds, who have less advanced educational experiences and particular life experiences, working with prisoners in that role. But what's interesting from the studies that we undertook was that this lower educational attainment had no influence upon your ability to achieve advanced roles in the prison service. So in theory, we should see the same composition of higher of roles with more responsibility in the prison service. We should see equal numbers of military and non-military staff in these governing roles. What that perhaps leads us to understand is that military experience brings with it a different set of qualities and characteristics, and that those experiences are valued. So it's very difficult for us to unpick perhaps some of the considerations that you might associate with social class, at least if that's what your question was leading towards. We didn't particularly interrogate or cluster against things like income or regional area of the country, so we haven't been able to unpick some of those nuances, but I think what we're quite clear on is that there is some value to prior career experiences in the military, and that despite perhaps lower formal education attainment, that is no barrier to progression in a prison service career.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And how about ethnicity? Because my experience of a prison service staff is that they are predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly white in background, white British, I suppose.
And that's certainly reflective of our sample. But, we Dom's already hinted towards kind of restrictions on funding and the nature of the project. And so, we'll admit, I think, quite happily that this was a fairly, we use the word pilot because I think that's most appropriate, but I'll call it pilot with excellent data capabilities. But nevertheless, a fairly small sample, 228 current and former prison staff across the country, which is not necessarily going to capture all of the ethnicity nuances, but certainly reflective of what you've just said there, David. Yes, predominantly a white workforce. But that's also reflective of the demographics of military service more broadly anyway.
Thank you. So, can you tell us how you conducted your research?
Shall I begin?
Feel free.
Yeah. Okay. So I suppose we put together an online survey, which was intended to probe military background, experience, the length of time that somebody had served, the kind of experience they had whether that had involved combat experience or not, the rank that they had managed to get to within that service. And then it asked a set of questions for those who had military service about their military and civilian transition. So their kind of thoughts and feelings upon leaving the military, the intentions they had, the plans they had for the work that they would then go on to do. And then a set of questions which explored prison work experience itself and sort of feelings about military experience and what it might mean for those who joined the prison service. Importantly, we opened this survey to both people with and without military background. We're interested partly to widen the appeal of it, to try to get as many people to fill out the survey as we could, but also because we thought it was important to learn from people who didn't have a military background but who were working in the prison service about what they thought about their colleagues who did have this background. And I suppose we did this because partly we just wanted to know how many people have this experience, because there isn't any published data on this topic. Although we'd seen in those anecdotal sort of very passing references that academic researchers had made in the kind of work that we've talked about already, people saying, half of staff have this experience, or more than half have this experience, but never giving us any sources for this information. And it seemed to be a sort of an anecdotal kind of finger in the air guess about how many there might be. And we thought, it's quite important, to understand how many people in the prison service have this experience, and also perhaps how much it's changed over time. So particularly by opening up the survey, as Jen has said, to former staff, so those who have left the prison service already, as well as at 6 prisons, those who are currently working in it, we were able to sort of track back, I suppose, quite a long way, back to the 1960s, I think it was, our respondents who joined the prison service at the earliest point, and ask them about the percentage of colleagues who they thought when they joined the prison service had this background. And I think what we saw through the results of that survey about asking people to judge the workforce which they had joined and the level of armed forces experience in it, that the percentage of those who have this experience has fallen over time from around between 50 to 75% to around 1 in 4 now. I mean, 1 in 4 is still quite a lot, and we always compared this to veterans in custody, who are a really important group whose experience within the prison service has been thought about quite carefully. And one of the reasons why attention has been drawn to it is that it's thought that they are the largest sort of employee group, in that there's more of them as a sort of a set of people with a particular set of prior experience than there are of any other sort of job group within the prisoner population. And yet the percentage of the prisoner population that they make up is much smaller than 1 in 4, and yet all this research attention has been directed to them. So I suppose the more that we dug into it, the more that we thought this matters. Prison staff's armed forces experience is something that's worth researching for further, albeit so far we are limited in what we can say by what our survey asked people about. But it did, as Jen's hinted at, talk about the ways in which people advance through the prison workforce, how they achieve advanced roles. And it also asked them, I think quite importantly, and perhaps Jen can talk a bit more on this topic because she did all the sort of clever stats work here about the attitudes that people hold to what the prison service should be for. So I suppose this was one way of us trying to test the assumption that some of our colleagues might have made about what it is that armed forces service brings to a prison staff member. So, for example, if it's true that they are more sort of power oriented, more discipline focused and so on, we might assume that if we were to offer them a choice of, asking, is the prison for rehabilitation or punishment or deterrence, that they might choose the punishment option. But that isn't quite what we found. I mean, Jen, do you want to talk through what our findings said?
Yes, let's talk findings. So I suppose interestingly, again, when we talk about this fairly small sample, but then nevertheless, I think I should say to all those quantitative scholars out there, enough for statistical significance where necessary, according to my various testing strategies. So the first inherent problem that I think we came to was that we had this cohort of whom just under 65% were current staff, therefore 35% former staff, but 58% of them had military experience. Now, that's really interesting, but that wasn't enough for us to write into a paper. 2/3 of prison staff have got military experience. We don't know whether our survey was attractive to people who had military experience. Maybe they were interested in sharing their views, but then that led us to some interesting statistical need for balancing out against the bias that might be caused by prior military experience. So we first looked at their composition, looking through which forces they'd been part of, Army, Royal Navy, RAF, and so on, and we found that those mirrored the general composition of the British Armed Forces more widely, predominantly Army leavers, with interesting nuances across their different career experiences, the different types of roles that they've done within those armed forces occupations. But what we did see more generally is that we had quite a high number in our cohort who had experience with combat roles, and many that had seen combat, which was the phrase that we use, which we had to unpack a little bit in terms of what that actually means, and our terminology was loosely related to sort of holding a weapon or firing a weapon against under enemy attack, so to speak. So we had a high proportion of people in our sample who had experienced combat, but we were quite interested in this transition from military service to a post-military career. We were influenced a lot by wider literature on this, and as Dominique said earlier on, the oftentimes problematic transition from military careers to post-military careers for some parts of the post-military cohort. So we explored a lot the many reasons why people left the armed forces, and then through to why they had chosen their onward career, in this case the prison service. So what we found is that within our cohort of ex-military personnel working in the prison service, almost half of the sample of those prison officers had left the military through time served. So what that means is that they didn't choose to leave the military. Their career period had ended, and they were moving on to a second career, for want of a better phrase. The other way that often people can leave the military is through voluntary outflow. They choose for some reason not to continue their service, and they go on to other things. We compared the percentage of people who left through voluntary outflow against the general military leavers, and we found that, much more of many more people in our sample stayed in the military longer. I'm paraphrasing here, but does that mean that we have a cohort of prison staff with military experience who are very committed? They're very committed to in particular, a Crown service, and they can stay the distance, so to speak. Again, I might be generalising for those who leave via voluntary alpha, but we seem to have this cohort of ex-military staff, prison staff, who are committed to a Crown
Sorry,
service.
Jen, by that do you mean those who stayed until they were no longer able to stay?
Exactly. They had no more years left available to them. They've either aged out or had finished a maximum contract length.
And if I can jump in, Jen, I think, as you've said, that might indicate that this is a particular group of people with a commitment, a resilience, an ability to kind of see out hard times, and it might well be that one of the, if this is the case, and if this has been the case perhaps over time, this might indicate that one of the reasons why historically we've had a lot of ex-forces people in the prison service, and perhaps they've stayed within the prison service longer than those who don't have a military background, might be connected to the experience they've had, the hard times they've seen, the difficulties they've had to overcome within their military service. Perhaps that sets them up quite well for the difficult and stressful experiences that they will have within the prison service. Now, we can't say that for sure, but it might well be that in recruitment, this is sort of a known thing from senior prison staff. They might know through their own experience that if you hire someone with a military background, they're going to stick at the job, rather than someone who might be more willing to leave. And maybe this finding that Jen's been talking through, of the fact that the military staff that we included in our survey had sort of stayed the distance in their military career, perhaps would indicate how they would act within their prison service work also. But
No,
sorry,
that's
Jen.
great. It's a great concept, and I think that's also interesting in the context of the armed forces more broadly, where we are seeing an increase over time in the number of people who are leaving the military early. So we are seeing an upward trend towards that. Voluntary alpha is increasing as the rationale for leaving the military. So again, this is a specific set of prison staff with a particular set of qualities, so to speak. Having said all that, what we found that was really interesting is that the majority of former military personnel who ended up in the prison service didn't want to be there as their first choice. So we found that only 22% of those with military experience actually wanted to join the prison service, although more than 3/4 of the people we surveyed had intended to apply for what we might call a protective services occupation. The police, the fire service, the border enforcement, or similar security services role. Although 3/4 had applied to a protective service occupation, the majority of those wanted to go into the police or the fire service. So our study suggested that our military personnel working in the prison service had kind of drifted into this role. Typically, they took about 4 years to get to the prison service after leaving the military. And so I suppose arguably, do we see a cohort of people who are, yes, they're very committed people, they've got qualities of diligence to service roles and so on, but maybe they didn't want to be in the prison service at all. They were motivated by job security, great pensions, consistency of working hours, and all kinds of really positive qualities, but maybe not intending to be there. And so that was really interesting. And so we've explored this in a bit more detail in terms of what that means then for their introduction into the prison service, their experiences of training, and then a little bit now towards the end of what was quite a long survey, their kind of attention to their job performance and the way that they feel about their time in the prison service. And that was quite interesting. We found that former military personnel were more likely to be punctual. They were more likely to show comfort with wearing a uniform, be proud of wearing a uniform. They were quite happy to be using terms like sir and miss that we often hear in the prison context. Perhaps things that we would expect that align to military experience. So we saw statistical significant difference. What we didn't see is former military personnel being more likely to be appreciative of the kind of hierarchical system that the prison service has to offer. That could be because it's a different kind of system. Different ranking systems in the prison service maybe don't map onto the same ones that they use in terms of the military. We saw some core differences between particularly early experiences in the prison service among the different cohorts, both former military personnel and otherwise. So that was really interesting, given that they didn't want to be there at all.
So were you meaning, Jen, that they had less respect for the hierarchy in the prison service as compared to having respect for the hierarchy in the services?
Sorry, no, just to clarify, what I mean was that we asked them if that they easily appreciated the hierarchical system in terms of, that they had familiarity with the provision of orders, so to speak, from more advanced roles and so on. But they were no more or less likely to appreciate that system than their colleagues without military backgrounds.
And that's interesting, but I think, I have heard a lot of servicemen to some degree denigrate the hierarchy above them as people that don't have the experience to do the actual job, but making these kind of decisions. So in some ways that seems kind of familiar.
I think maybe that might have something to do as well with the composition of the cohort of our military cohort. In terms of, we had a cohort with predominantly non-commissioned officer roles, and even my brief experiences into the way the military works in my younger days. Then we do have some different philosophies going on in relation to commissioned and non-commissioned officers, but that maps on as well to their background qualifications. So we didn't see too many higher ranked or commissioned officers coming through into the prison service, but that might also be as a result of time served as well. A point at which those military personnel had got to a point in their personal lives, their aged lives, so to speak, not to need to go on to secondary careers.
This is all very fascinating, isn't it? And I'm wondering, I've got time in mind, and I'm wondering where might be the best place to go in the remaining time that we have. What do you guys think? What are the key points that we haven't highlighted?
I think there's an interesting point maybe to talk about around the premises in which prisons are located. So Jen has sort of hinted at this a bit already, and I suppose one of the ways in which we've been thinking about the prison is as a military landscape. Can we think of it in this way? And I suppose we've been thinking about the different ways in which the military influence comes into the prison. So we know already that there's a lot of veterans in custody. We haven't done any research into them apart from asking a couple of questions in our survey around whether people had experience of working with veterans, perhaps on veterans' wings and so on, because there has been a tiny bit of research up to now about how veterans in custody might feel about being worked with by people with a military background. So there's one body of thought which says that this shared background, this brothers in arms type of thing might be a positive. They might share some experiences, understand one another in a in that way. Alternatively, it could well be that veterans in custody feel a little bit embarrassed in front of ex-military staff that things haven't worked out so well for them, despite perhaps the experience that they've had in the military and the advantages that it might have been able to offer to them. So perhaps that's a source of tension, but that's not something that we could sort of look into it, especially in that way. But we were also interested, I suppose, in the ways in which military connections take form in the prisons themselves in a tangible, a physical way. So I'm sure that anyone who's been into a prison that's been there for some time has seen the military memorials in prisons, the plaques that there often are up to former prison staff who've served in the military, and certain prisons have other things in them, sort of mini cenotaphs and so on, which we think are quite interesting. How do these come about? Why are they there? What role can they play, and so on? And do they play a particular role for ex-military personnel of whatever kind now spending time in those buildings? And as Jen has said already, there's lots of prisons which are constructed out of or on the site of RAF bases, military bases and so on, and we know very little indeed about how those transitions took form, or how important they are, or indeed sort of how significant the transformation of military buildings into prison service buildings is. So if you look, for example, at aerial pictures of RAF bases during the war, and then have a look at those which have been converted into prisons in the post-war period, many of them have kept the kind of H-shaped blocks which were built by the RAF as part of the places where the servicemen would live, and they've kind of filled in the parade ground with a football pitch or an astroturf, or whatever, but essentially the layout of those places is the same. And there could be all sorts of sort of hangovers, I suppose, from the military nature of that place, in terms of how the prison that's now functioning there would work, how it's operating. I mean, Foucault, who lots of academic researchers talk about, and his work on the prison, he talks about the prison being like a barracks, and there being all kinds of connections in between these spaces, and I suppose that's something further which could be explored. And then there's all sorts of questions about, I suppose, the geography of prison location. So there's quite a bit of debate right now about where new prisons ought to be. Lots of concerns about where new prisons should be built. Should they be urban, rural? Where should they be? And of course, prisons are really expensive things to build. They need quite a large plot of land, and if you're looking to minimise the cost of building a new one, you would try to build it on land that the government already owns, and lots of that land is owned by the MOD, and that land gets transferred to the MOJ, and the prison gets built there. Earlier on in time, after the Second World War, the prison service expanded, the population expanded. There was a need to quite fast kind of get new prisons working. These were built on RAF bases largely, so they tended to end up being where those RAF bases were, which of course in the Second World War they needed to be on large flat areas of land near to the North Sea. So that's why there's so many in Norfolk, Lincolnshire and so on. So we've ended up with a geography of imprisonment that really is a military geography to an extent, that we've built prisons, or we've constructed prisons within military bases because that's where the military bases were, not necessarily because that's the best place for prisons to be, if we think about them perhaps being near to courts, near to families and so on. And of course that maybe has implications for potentially, particularly in that post-war period, the recruitment of prison staff to work in those bases from a population who perhaps had a military connection through the location of the military bases in their town and so on. So I suppose the more that we think about this, the more of these interconnections there turn out to be, and the more interesting, I suppose, for us this gets in trying to unpick those connections and how significant they are. And then I guess there's all sorts of national level discourse about this. So our most famous prison reformers, Sir Edward Ducan, Alexander Patterson, and so on, are ex-military themselves. Rory Stewart, served his time for at least some short time during this period. So I suppose there's all kinds of linkages between the prison and the military that we think bear further investigation.
Can I just ask Dominique, I suppose it drew to mind our previous conversation about green space, and obviously a lot of...
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're right. So lots of those prisons which are built on military bases, not all of them, I suppose, because lots of them are built on MOD land that had never been sort of built on in this way, but where it had been, and where those military bases were particularly RAF airfields, as you say, they're large. The prison doesn't always get to have all of the sort of RAF base in it. Some of it is sold off. The aircraft hangars become, storage units or whatever, but still there's a fair green patch of land there. So I think we do see greener prisons when they're built on these kind of bases, but on the flip side, I suppose we're sort of balancing out the potential well-being benefit of that green space by the fact that by virtue of their location, these prisons perhaps tend to be further from the conurbations perhaps from which the incarcerated come. So I suppose there's that balance of, is it better to have a green view or to be to have frequent family visits which might come from being nearer to home. And I'm not sure that I want to say which of those two things is the more valuable. It'd be nice to have both.
So perhaps I could just ask a final question leading on from that, which is, does that influence and involvement of ex-military personnel, does that have any implications for physical and emotional well-being for staff or indeed people living in prison?
Gosh, I think that's a really, really hard question, Naomi, and I think it comes down to the diversity perhaps of this group and how little we understand of the benefits or challenges indeed that military experience might bring to the prison workforce. I mean, each person's different, right? Each person will bring from their military experience a particular set of characteristics and sort of values perhaps which they then bring to bear within the prison service. There might be an indication, as the results that Jennifer was talking through show us, that maybe ex-forces personnel have a certain level of resilience which enables them to cope better with the stresses of prison work. I'd stress that we can't prove that, we're speculating here, but it might be that their work within the armed forces and the reason that they've left the armed forces might indicate this sort of stickability, if you like. But it could also be that to an extent some of our colleagues might be right in the things that they've previously said about military experience and prison work, that maybe people cope with prison work by being quite tough and having quite a hard shell, and perhaps that can come across sometimes as a lack of compassion, which then I guess would have implications for the prisoner population with whom they work. But to kind of turn that on its head a bit, there's some fantastic research been done by Ben Crew and his colleagues at Cambridge, which looks at prison staff cultures, and it kind of takes apart to an extent this notion that the exercise of power is necessarily bad by staff, and it kind of really carefully nuances the nature of power and how it's used, and it indicates that a quite sort of quote unquote traditional prison workforce that's boundaried, confident, can use humour, perhaps banter to an extent, to kind of defuse situations, holds a line, isn't too friendly, could be demonstrating exactly the kind of power that makes the imprisoned population feel safe, feel that more force could be used if necessary, but it's not going to be used unless it's necessary. And some of our findings and the qualitative answers that we had to our survey gave us a sense in which maybe the best of the ex-military personnel were able to demonstrate those kinds of qualities, that maybe their military experience gave them a set of skills that enabled them to act in that kind of way, to be clear and boundaried, to use humour when necessary, to kind of, and perhaps their courage and bearing, and perhaps some sort of maybe on the part of the imprisoned population, a sense that their military background might mean certain things, even if it didn't, might give them a sort of, might enable them to act in that way that Ben Crew is saying with colleagues is kind of not an optimal way, but is certainly a valued way forward. And that again might contribute to the well-being of imprisoned people, in terms of feeling that the prison staff are on top of the situation but will be fair, and hence they feel safer, which I guess has to be good for you, right?
Yeah, I think that's dead right. I think what you're describing is the capacity to produce a feeling of containment and subsequently safety.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's kind of key for us perhaps is thinking about, that we're talking, I guess, primarily about former military staff who are working in the prison service now and the influence they are having on the prison service now. But we know, that there's been a lot of ex-forces personnel working in the prison service for a really long time, and I would imagine that there's been a sort of a cumulative effect, right, over time, that's led the prison service to be the institution that it is now, and that the characteristics of the military have changed over that time. We might be seeing, for example, people coming out of the military now who have been in a more sort of UN peacekeeping type of role, which might be different, for example, from people who served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, which would be different again from people who'd seen service in the Second World War and so on. So, the nature of the military, both in terms of the combat experience or the sort of on exercise kind of experience that those personnel might have had, will have changed. The prison service itself has changed over time, and there's, I guess, has been a relationship between the prison service and the military in terms of handling the numbers of people who are demobilised, right, and the sense in which the Ministry of Justice, or its sort of prior forms, needs to be a destination for the Ministry of Defence for those people who are leaving the armed forces, right? And so I think we see, and our research has really only started to kind of tap into this, the ways in which the percentage of the military population within the prison workforce maps onto the demobilisation of these armed forces personnel over time. So we see kind of a bulge after Northern Ireland, obviously a bulge after the Second World War, and so on. And I think that perhaps maybe links into perceived changes in the philosophy of the prison service over time. So times at which it's been, supposedly more harsh, and then kind of swings to rehabilitation and so on. And the extent to which the movement into it of armed forces staff might have influenced or indeed been reflected by those different changes. I think there's everything that we're saying here is kind of stuff that we speculate about but don't quite know the answer to, and it's nice, I suppose, to see, since the first paper that we wrote, increasing numbers of PhD students taking on some of these questions, and I hope that they'll get to the bottom of the things that we don't yet know the answers to.
Thank you. Jennifer, last thought from you?
I think that one of the things that is really interesting going on from this is not just, as Dom has really nicely summarised, the potential impacts of military careers upon the experiences and perhaps performances of the prison service itself, but is perhaps the reciprocal relationship. The question of what experiences from the military might be somehow enhanced or brought out negatively by experiences then in the prison service. Can a military background also trigger particular experiences around health and well-being whilst working in prison employ? We know that the majority of people who transition from military careers go on to have successful lives. We know that is proven research, but we also know, given, as Dom mentioned, this high percentage of veterans in custody, to use that phrase, we know that military lives can be stressful. Add that then to what we know about working in prisons. We know that working in prisons is also a challenging environment. And so for all of the positives and resilience that we've just described, commitment, adaptability that we see from ex-forces prison staff, what potential problems or challenges might this cohort face in terms of dealing with traumatic or challenging experiences within the prison service? Don't want to end on a negative, so I don't want to mention too many of those things, but we had in our cohort, for example, a large number who had experienced combat, who had high numbers of tours of duty, and at those particular times in conflict zones, with no doubt challenging experiences to recall. So some further work that I think that we need to do, and that we're continuing to do with other colleagues, and particularly in the Canadian context, is to think through this reciprocal relationship, because in order to maintain positive staff performances, I think you need to understand the prior career experiences, and particularly the traumatic prior career experiences of your staff, and in this case of up to 25% of your staff, and that's a really important thing to learn.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a good place to stop, I think, with that thoughtful comment. Lovely to see you again, Dominique, and very nice to meet you, Jennifer.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it was a lovely conversation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.